The most recent edition of Wired magazine about taking eCash mainstream. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Live coverage of the House. They begin their legislative hour now.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, for much of the past decade, Iran's nuclear weapons program has been a top national security concern for the United States. And Iran, armed with nuclear weapons capable of threatening Israel and other regional states, would touch off a nuclear arms race in the world's most volatile region. For this reason, I have pressed for ever-increasing sanctions to isolate Iran from the global economy, and have supported a policy that leaves all options on the table, including military force. The stakes are too high to risk any miscalculation of our resolve by Iran's leaders. In pushing for ever more punitive sanctions, I have held out the hope that increased economic pressure might force Iran to give up its nuclear weapons ambition and rejoin the community of nations. Now we are at a moment in the standoff with Tehran that will test that assumption. In repeated statements since his election as Iran's new president in June, Hassan Rouhani expressed interest in exploring a negotiated end to the sanctions in exchange for walking back its nuclear program. While the first Geneva meeting did not lead to a breakthrough on an interim deal, the parties reportedly came close and will be reconvening today for a second round. Some have called on the Senate to continue work on a new round of sanctions that was passed by the House with my support earlier this year. Advocates of this approach say that sanctions brought us to this point, and increased pressure during the negotiations will improve the likelihood of success at the bargaining table. I disagree. President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry have asked for more time to test Iran's willingness to enter into a tough and verifiable agreement, and I think we should give it to them. I'm pleased to see reports that there appears to be a bipartisan agreement in the Senate that will hold off for now. We'll know soon enough if the Iranian regime is serious about a new direction in its nuclear program and its relationship with the West. If it is not, there will be ample opportunity to tighten the stranglehold on Iran's economy, and further sanctions will have my full support. Some have warned that any relaxation in sanctions in an interim deal risks unraveling the whole sanctions regime. This is not an illusory concern, and for this reason, any partial lifting of the freeze on Iranian assets must be quickly reversible if the Iranians balk on a final deal. But the absence of an interim deal is also problematic if it means another 6 months of Iranian enrichment. The Iranians must be made to understand that if they walk away or cheat, the sanctions will be tightened to the point of strangulation, and the international community must be prepared to make good on that threat. I have no illusions about the character of the Iranian regime, nor do I trust it. I do not believe that we can look into Rouhani's eyes and see the truth, let alone his soul. Even if Rouhani was serious about his intentions, there's no guarantee that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, would bless any agreement that forces Iran to verifiably forswear development of the bomb. Ultimately, this is not about trust. It's not about making concessions to Iran or rewarding the mullahs for thwarting the will of the international community for many years. It is about seizing the opportunity to see whether we can end Iran's nuclear weapons program without resorting to military action. And if we cannot, no doubt will remain that the United States made every effort to resolve this grave threat diplomatically. No negotiation is without risk, and the Iranians' track record is cause for great skepticism. The administration must not accept a bad deal, but neither should it be prevented from testing whether it can obtain a good deal that advances our security interests and those of our allies. Yitzhak Rabin, the former Israeli Prime Minister who signed the Oslo Accords 2 decades ago, once noted that you make peace with your enemies, not the Queen of Holland. I agree and urge us to give diplomacy a chance. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize and congratulate General James D. Thurman on his retirement from the United States Army after 38 years of dedicated, distinguished, and honorable service. He will retire on November 22, 2013, concluding his service over the past 2 years as commander of the U.S. forces in Korea. During both war and peace, General Thurman has served with courage and distinction in the face of tremendous adversity, demonstrating his commitment to America and to our people. During his long and honorable career, General Thurman successfully commanded 10 different units at every echelon of command, including the extensive operational combat development and deployment. Besides his command of the 4th Infantry Division and the Multinational Division in Baghdad, Iraq, he made significant contributions during the initial invasion of Iraq as the Chief of Operations for Coalition Forces Land Component Command. Other notable assignments during his tenure included operations in Kosovo as Chief of Plans and Policy Division for Allied Forces Southern Europe, Battalion Executive Officer for the 1st Cavalry Division during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. In his final assignment, General Thurman served as a senior U.S. military officer in Korea, where he was responsible for 28,500 U.S. forces stationed there. His top command priority was to deter and defend against North Korean provocations and aggression, and should deterrence fail, be prepared to fight tonight and win. He ensured the readiness of his multinational combined and joint forces through a broad range of additions. As a result of a change he directed during the 2 annual multinational combined and joint exercises in Korea, forces under his command, because of most mission-focused training sessions in his U.S. history of U.S.-ROC relations. His initial assessment of existing capabilities on the peninsula resulted in the addition of an armed reconnaissance squadron and other changes to better prepare U.S. forces to respond. His steady hand and strong relationship with ROC counterparts, as well as senior civilian and military leaders in the U.S., was critical to safely navigating several operational crises. A native of Marietta, Oklahoma, General Thurman graduated from East Central Oklahoma University, where he earned a commission through the Reserve Officer Training Corps. His first assignment was with the 4th Infantry Division, which he later commanded and deployed with to Iraq. Since his first assignment, he and his wife, Delia, known as Dee Thurman, have moved 25 times in 38 years, including 4 tours in Germany, 2 at the National Training Center, 3 in my district at Fort Hood, Texas. During that time, he raised 2 daughters, and they are proud grandparents. Retirement is to be celebrated and enjoyed. It is not the end of a career, but the beginning of a new adventure. I commend General Thurman for his selfless service to the nation and to the United States Army. I wish him and his wife the best in years ahead and welcome them as new constituents to the 31st Congressional District. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, next week is Thanksgiving. All of us in this chamber will go back to our districts and we will celebrate this holiday with our families, usually with a big turkey dinner with all the fixings and all these wonderful desserts. But, Mr. Speaker, for millions and millions of Americans, they won't have anything to celebrate next week. They don't have enough to put food on the table for their families, because there are close to 50 million people in the United States of America, the richest country in the history of the world, that are hungry. Close to 17 million of them are kids. And Mr. Speaker, in the face of these terrible statistics, we have a Congress that is working overtime to make life for many of these people even more miserable. There has already been a cut in SNAP as a result of the ending of the Recovery Act monies that provided an extra boost to the program. So everybody who's on this program on November 1st received a cut in their benefit, a benefit that is on average about $1.50 per meal per day. They received a cut. And on top of that, the House of Representatives passed a farm bill that has an additional $40 billion cut in this program. That would result in millions of families who currently receive the benefit losing it altogether. It would result in hundreds of thousands of children who right now are able to take advantage of a free breakfast and lunch program at school. They would lose that benefit. And it would result in about 170,000 veterans losing their benefit. And I want to talk a little bit today about our veterans and about how they are being adversely impacted by some of the policies that we are pursuing here in the House of Representatives. Jonathan Capehart of the Washington Post on November 1st wrote a column entitled, "Oh Snap, Veterans Get Dissed by the GOP." I want to read the first few paragraphs of his piece. He says, "Remember all the howling by Republicans about the closed monuments and war memorials during the Ted Cruz government shutdown? Remember how they helped World War II vets storm their memorial on the very first day? Remember how one of the members of Congress snarled at a Park Service ranger for trying to abide by the law and keep the memorial closed to the public? Remember how the likes of Cruz and Sarah Palin railed against President Obama for the cuts to veterans' benefits that resulted from the Cruz-caused shutdown? Our veterans should be above political games," Cruz said at the Million Vets March on October 13th. He continued by saying, "Veterans have proven they are not timid, and we will not be timid in calling out anybody that uses the military as pawns." Palin said at the same event, "We can only be America, home of the free, if we are America, home of the brave." So Capehart continues to write, "So pardon the forthcoming blue language, but where the hell are they now that a multi-billion-dollar cut to the food stamp program has hit thousands of veterans squarely in their wallets?" That, he was referring to the cut that occurred on November 1st. According to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, in any given month, a total of 900,000 veterans nationwide lived in households that relied on SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, to provide food for their families. On any given year or any given month, millions and millions of dollars of SNAP funds are spent at military commissaries to help feed military families and their families who struggle against hunger. Mr. Speaker, I raise this issue because there seems to be somewhat of a contradiction here in this People's House of Representatives. We're all very good at kind of talking the talk. People get up time and time again and talk about how important and how wonderful our veterans are. We all go back to our districts on Veterans Day and Memorial Day, and we praise our veterans. We thank them for their service to their country and for their sacrifice. But when it comes to making sure that our veterans have enough to eat, have enough food to put on their table for their families, we're worse than indifferent in this House of Representatives. We're making things worse for them. If this cut that the House of Representatives passed goes into effect, this $40 billion cut in SNAP, as I said, 170,000 veterans and their families will lose their benefit altogether. This is on top of a cut in their benefit that they've already received. I mean, I don't know what people think is meant by praising our veterans, but, instead of talking the talk, we ought to walk the walk a little bit more. We ought to make sure that the men and women who served our country, who this Congress voted to send over to Iraq and send over to Afghanistan, we ought to ensure that when they come back, that they at least have enough to eat. Many veterans that come back have a tough time getting back into the workforce. And yet some of the language that was put in the House Farm Bill would actually make it almost impossible for them to get this benefit. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues as we approach Thanksgiving to not forget our veterans.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I'm again on the floor today because our nation has failed to heed the warning of George Washington, who told us to beware of foreign entanglements. We have lost over 4,474 Americans in Iraq and 2,276 Americans in Afghanistan, In both of these wars combined, 46,720 of our service members have been wounded. Furthermore, the American taxpayer is spending $10.5 million every hour to pay for the cost of the war in Afghanistan since 2001. Mr. Speaker, let me repeat that. We're spending $10.45 million an hour just to pay for the money spent in Afghanistan since 2001. Despite these facts, we are now entering into a long-term agreement that at best is a failure. At best is a failure. It is with great disappointment that I share an NBC article entitled, and I quote, "Endless Afghanistan. United States-Afghanistan agreement would keep troops in place and funds flowing perhaps indefinitely, perhaps until 2024. I would like to read a short paragraph and ask unanimous consent that a few additional excerpts to be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
And I quote, "While many Americans have been led to believe the war in Afghanistan will soon be over, a draft of a key United States-Afghan security deal obtained by NBC News shows that the United States is prepared to maintain military outposts in Afghanistan for many years to come and pay to support hundreds of thousands of Afghanistan security forces." Mr. Speaker, George Washington was right. Afghanistan is an impossible situation. History has proven that it is impossible. The bilateral security agreement will only serve to endanger American lives and squander taxpayers' money. I implore my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in standing up for the American people in opposition to the signing of this agreement. Mr. Speaker, the President has the constitutional right to enter into the agreement, and we have no oversight on the agreement itself, but we can put a resolution on the floor and let the Congress debate and let the American people know that we realize what we're doing in Afghanistan. Instead of continuing to pass budget bills to fund Karzai. Mr. Speaker, I've got a little poster here of Karzai. The man is a corrupt leader, and all he is doing is taking the taxpayers' money and becoming richer and richer. And Mr. Speaker, the funny and sad thing about this in this poster, it's a cartoon. There's a poor American soldier standing behind Karzai who's at a money machine, and it says, the thoughts of the soldier is, "I'd like to make a quick withdrawal from here." To the American soldier, I'm sorry to say, but if we don't do our job in Congress, you will be there until 2024. The American people need to call their members of Congress and say that we do not accept this agreement to keep our troops there until 2024. If you can't stop it, at least have a debate on the floor of the House and pass a resolution to say this is what the American people want to see. No long-term agreement with Afghanistan. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will yield back my time, but first I want to thank God for blessing our troops and blessing America. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to share with you another letter I received from a constituent about the Affordable Care Act. He writes, and I quote, "About 9 months ago, my wife was forced to leave her job, in part because they wanted her to travel to Boston twice a week, and the responsibilities to care for our daughter, who has cerebral palsy, made that impossible. Our health insurance was from her employment." I continue the quote. "We went on to COBRA, which cost about $1,400 per month. Waiting to have permanent insurance that did not have a termination date, we contacted Anthem Blue Cross for a quote for private insurance. We were told that my wife was uninsurable for 10 years because she had been treated for depression a few years ago when our daughter was diagnosed with cerebral palsy, and we were told that she would require spinal cord surgery to possibly walk. Then they said, because of her condition, his wife's condition, the cost for only my daughter and I was almost $4,000 per month. The burden for the last 6 months was overwhelming. Insurance brokers informed us that only the Affordable Health Care could help us. Yesterday, my wife signed up for health insurance for all of us. Due to our income, we do not qualify for assistance, and we were never looking for any. All we wanted was affordable insurance for my family. The policy we selected will end up costing about what our COBRA payment is, $1,400, depending on how much deductible we end up using, which is all we ever wanted. I know the only reason our family is safe is because of the President, who cares more about people like us than the CEO of Anthem, Blue Cross, or Aetna. Mr. Speaker, I receive calls and letters like this all the time. It is why that I worked so hard to pass the Affordable Care Act in the first place. This is a transformative piece of legislation, a law that provides more security for the middle class and a better, healthy quality of life for the entire community. It empowers patients and doctors again and puts them and not insurers back at the center of care. And it makes important, long overdue reforms that most people just take as common sense. But for 3 years now, this House Republican majority has been trying to roll the clock back, bring back the bad old days when insurance companies could discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions, even children with pre-existing conditions once again. They want to see women pay more for the same coverage than men, be denied coverage because they survived breast cancer, were a victim of domestic violence, or had a child by cesarean section. They want to see small businesses lose tax credits. Seniors' health care and drug costs continue to rise at staggering rates. But we are not going to go back. The Affordable Care Act is already making a profound difference for individuals and families in need, and it is time to stop with the partisan political games and let it work for families who desperately need to have health care coverage and insurance that they can't afford. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to take this time to talk about some European issues, especially in Eastern Europe. First, I want to talk about the country of Belarus. 3 years after the brutal and bloody crackdown on peaceful demonstrators after the December 2010 presidential election, 9 political prisoners remain behind bars under deplorable conditions in Belarus. This includes Nikolai Statkevich, who ran against Lukashenko in 2010, Ales Vayetsky, the head of Visna, a human rights organization, and Mikhail Atatkovich, who sliced his stomach in September to protest his poor treatment by prison guards. While the regime recently released 3 political activists, Dmitry Dashkevich, Alexander Frankovich, and Pavel Severitsnets, it continues to restrict their freedom of movement and activities. The general human rights situation in Belarus also continues to deteriorate. Recent laws passed to regulate demonstrations and political information have greatly curtailed freedom of assembly, and independent journalists and political activists are under constant threat of intimidation and arbitrary detention. In October, the regime made amendments to the electoral code designed to undermine the ability of opposition candidates to receive funding and compete in the 2014 local elections. The EU voted in October to expand sanctions on the Lukashenko regime for an additional year, citing the regime's failure to release or effectively rehabilitate political prisoners and its disregard for human rights or democratic principles in their decision-making. The United States should continue to work with the European Union to remain consolidated, impose economic sanctions, and have a single plan of action regarding the promotion of democratic processes in Belarus. Tensions with Russia increased when the Lukashenko regime arrested Vladislav Baumgartner, a Russian citizen who is the head of a major Russian potash firm. The move was in retaliation for this firm dropping its joint venture with local Belarusian potash firm, resulting in a steep drop in the commodity price and harming the Belarusian economy. This began an ongoing potash war with Russia. Meanwhile, negotiations to put Russia air base in Belarus has proved controversial and allowed opposition parties an opening to criticize the regime and focus attention on national independence and sovereignty issues. The United States should continue to support Belarusian citizens as they fight to maintain their sovereignty. Also, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about the Eastern Partnership. On November 28th through 29th, just coming up soon, the European Union will host the Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. The goal of the event is to promote closer ties between the EU and its eastern neighbors, and in particular, to further the progress on association agreements with Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. The governments of these countries have worked for years to meet conditions for signing the agreements, and the summit is viewed as an historic step in European integration for these countries. Russia has responded to the Eastern Partnership Initiative by applying intense pressure on these countries to abandon EU engagement and join a Russian-led Eurasian Union instead. Russia has started erecting barbed wire fences on Georgia territory, prompting a stern rebuke from the EU, condemning the action and calling for their removal. In Moldova, Russia has resorted to its usual tactics of banning Moldovan wine imports and threatening to cut off gas during the winter months. Russia has banned dairy products from Lithuania and certain chocolate products from the Ukraine and threatened for both countries with disruption or price hikes on gas supplies. The EU has warned Russia to stop these actions, and the U.S. should join in the condemnation of Russia's aggressive behavior towards the sovereignty of nations on its border. So that, Mr. Speaker, I want to appreciate this time for talking about these emerging democracies in Eastern Europe, the threat that still continues, and the importance of the United States government being involved in promoting democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, we've been in this huge debate around the Affordable Care Act for quite a while now, and one of the things that I cannot ever forget is the health care nightmare stories that I listened to before we passed the Affordable Care Act. As I see so many of my Republican colleagues gleefully celebrate the difficulties with the website or cancellations, and then think that that's going to somehow help them in an election, I can't think about any election. All I can think about are people like the people who I want to share with you right now. So let me tell you about Marty Olson. Marty built a small business creating marble sinks and countertops. He poured everything he had into his business, and it flourished. He became a job creator in the language of some people. In other words, I would call him a small business person. I call his customers job creators. Just a few years ago, he employed more than a half a dozen employees. Recently, things changed drastically for him. Over the course of last year, his 9-year-old daughter, Abby, was diagnosed with leukemia. She beat the odds and was in remission for 6 months until her cancerous symptoms returned. She's now awaiting a bone marrow transplant, and Mr. Olson spent time with his ailing daughter, and his business began to decrease. He's now the sole employee of the marble business. 3 months ago, he suffered a detached artery and had heart surgery. He's still recuperating from his surgery and losing his insurance on January 1st due to a divorce. He began to search for the affordable health insurance, but most premium quotes were much too much for him to afford. The implementation of the Affordable Care Act means he'll not be denied insurance due to his pre-existing heart condition. The health care exchange in Minnesota, called Minsure.org, is allowing him to purchase a policy he can afford. Without the plans available on the Minnesota Health Care Exchange, he likely would have to choose between health insurance or paying his other monthly bills. When his business is growing, he often trained employees to increase production, but sometimes lost that employee because he was unable to provide them with adequate health care insurance plan. The Small Business Exchange is there for him to use when his business grows in the future again. Of course, Marty's not by himself in this. Tracy Brock is another small business owner. She's provided over a small business for 21 years. She's able to earn enough to support herself and hire several part-time employees. However, her health insurance premium have forced her to work 6 to 7 days a week. Those high premiums, around $650 each month, prevent her from taking time to enjoy life and to get some well-deserved rest. Her insurance premiums were taking up most of her marginal profits. The assets from her business disqualified her from receiving any assistance with her premiums. Tracy had the misfortune of being a cancer patient. She also needs knee replacement surgery, and Ms. Brock's business has not been as profitable recently. So she continues to work every day despite her health conditions. She began researching MNsure.org, the healthcare exchange in Minnesota, available to folks who live in our state, and she found health plans with better coverage at prices she can afford. Some plans she found were only 50% of the cost of her current premium. The additional coverage will give her more options to treat her conditions, and the savings will allow her to work less and enjoy life more. I just want to say, Mr. Speaker, that, we shouldn't look at difficulties in the implementation with the Affordable Care Act as a political opportunity. We should never take our eye off the fact that we got people, we got citizens who desperately need something way better than we had before we had the Affordable Care Act. I wish Republicans would say, you know what, it's there, it's passed, the Constitution, the Supreme Court has said it's constitutional, and we're going to do everything we can to make it work, even if we would do it differently. And we'll offer constructive improvements, but we're not going to sit back and just try to wreck it with poison pill bills like the Upton bill last week, or with the 47 attempts to repeal it, or with the myriad of other tricks, sabotages, and devices that they have employed. It's time to help Americans like Marty Olson, like Tracy Brock, and like millions of other people, including one of my own interns, Abby Shanfield, who is an awesome young woman, has had numerous surgeries since she was 10 months old. And thanks to the Affordable Care Act, Abby is able to stay on her parents' insurance until she's 26, and her parents were able to pay premiums and co-pays that have given her access to the health care that she needs. So with that, and for many other reasons, I urge support of the Affordable Care Act. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Westmoreland, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I come before you today to honor 5 soldiers, those attached to and those of the 75th Ranger Battalion, Fort Benning, Georgia. Fort Benning is home to about 1,500 Rangers of the entire 75th Ranger Regiment. They are an elite group of soldiers who perform specialized operations for the Army. Currently, the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, as well as Rangers of the Regimental Headquarters and the Regimental Special Troop Battalion are deployed. I have a deep commitment to Fort Benning, and once these Rangers pass through Fort Benning, Georgia, they become part of the state's family. On October the 6th, 5 of these brave Rangers were part of a mission gone wrong. Sergeant Patrick Hawkins, Private First Class Cody Patterson, First Lieutenant Jennifer Marino, and Special Agent Joseph Peters were killed by an improvised explosive device while conducting combat operations in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. And Corporal Joshua Harris was seriously injured. These soldiers came to Fort Benning from across the nation. They are sons and daughters and parents, spouses, loved by many. Their loss is felt across our nation, and we thank them for paying the ultimate sacrifice. As we mourn the loss of these 4 soldiers, I also want to give thanks for the life of Corporal Joshua Harris. Corporal Harris was injured in the same mission on October the 6th and is pictured here beside me. This photo has been nicknamed the salute seen around the world because it shows the strong character of an American soldier. After hours of surgery, Corporal Harris, commander, held a small ceremony in the hospital room to honor Corporal Harris and received the Purple Heart. They thought he was unconscious. Doctors, nurses, fellow Rangers crowded to the room to watch him receive the award. Despite his injuries, tubes, and intense pain, Corporal Harris still saluted the commander when his Purple Heart was pinned on his hospital blanket. This act of determination, despite pain, embodies all that is a Ranger. This is the heart of a warrior. This is America. We need not apologize to anyone for our strength and our greatness. I want to thank these 5 brave Rangers, Sergeant Patrick Hawkins, PFC Cody Patterson, First Lieutenant Jennifer Marino, Special Agent Joseph Peters, and Corporal Joshua Harris for their service and their sacrifice. Joni and I send our prayers to their families and to their friends. God bless America, and God bless our troops. Now yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak about the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act is working for many of my constituents on the central coast of California, like Dana in San Luis Obispo County, who tells me she will be saving 40% on her family's premiums. And it is working for the Pacellas in Solvang, who tell me they now have better coverage while saving $8,000 a year on their premiums. And it is working for the thousands of families whose young adult children can continue on their parents' plans, and for everyone who has a pre-existing condition who now cannot be turned down for coverage. But I know that this is not the case for all Central Coast residents, especially those who may have received cancellation notices this year, either because their insurer is only selling in the exchanges or because the insurance companies have stopped offering plans in our area altogether. Cancellation of these plans has caused real pain and confusion for our constituents in California who are faced with covered California marketplace options that have different provider networks or different premium costs. After hearing numerous stories from the families I represent, it is clear that we must address this problem with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act so that we can protect all California families and businesses. The President has offered an administrative fix to this issue to allow insurance companies to offer plans to those already enrolled for the next year. But states will be the final decision makers. And that's why I led a letter with my colleague, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, and 22 of our California colleagues to Covered California's leadership, asking them to implement this administrative fix without delay. Covered California has led the way in bringing new and quality health care opportunities to millions of Californians. The website is working and enrollment is steadily increasing. But with over 1 million Californians who have received cancellation notices of their current plans, we must and we will do more to ensure that no one is left without the opportunity for affordable coverage. These families were told that if they liked their plan, they can keep it, and that is a promise we must make for them. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, President Obama purports to protect and defend the idea of open government, but his staff seems to have missed the memo. You see, just 5 months ago, I asked Treasury Secretary Jack Lew about his personal knowledge of the IRS's reprehensible practice of targeting innocent Americans. I inquired of him just 3 basic things, and one of which was, what was Secretary's knowledge and what was his involvement with any of the various meetings with the then IRS Commissioner, Doug Shulman, had at the White House. You see, back then, a year ago, Jack Lew served as the Chief of Staff to the President, while some of the most egregious, reprehensible behavior ever displayed by the IRS took place while Doug Shulman was the IRS Commissioner, and while Doug Shulman reportedly attended meetings at the White House at various times. Unfortunately, rather than answer some of these basic and simple questions and putting to bed any and all appearance of impropriety by Jack Lew, Secretary Lew continues to ignore all of my questions. The American people have the right to know. The American people have the right to know exactly what Secretary Lew knew and what he did. So I rise today to ask the American people to join with me in demand openness from this government, from this president, and from Secretary Jack Lew. Secretary Lew, it is time to answer the questions of the American public. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to speak of messages and missions yet undone. This Congress, both House and Senate, was sent here on behalf of the American people to ensure that their voices and their needs are adhered to. They're not interested in the clanging of voices. They're interested in the rolling up of sleeves and making sure our government works. And so I stand here in reflection of a very successful enrollment day in Houston, Texas, on last Saturday, where people came and stood in line to be able to seek information and, yes, enroll, because they have faith in this nation. And as the Affordable Care Act goes along and fixes broken promises and broken technology, what we should be focused on is making it work for the American people, making sure that those with pre-existing disease can have insurance, young people with minimal income can have insurance, those between 50 and 65 can have insurance, those with catastrophic illnesses can have insurance. I have faith as we work through this that what is best for the American people is their choices that they will have. And the fact that they will keep what they have and be able to enroll for a year is a response to the pain. But we know that the insurance companies did not need to send cancellation letters. They could have sent modification letters. But I want to go forward. And so, deeds yet finished. One happens to be the enormity of gun violence among our young people. That has reflected in the incidences in Houston, Texas. 19 shot, 2 dead, teenagers at a house party. This last weekend, 1 shot at a house party who has lost his life. My sympathy to their families. But I call out now for all of our forces, federal, local, and state, PTOs and school districts, teachers, civic organizations, and faith organizations, that we work together to be able to stop the surge, the siege of gun violence and the loss of our young people. Statistics will show that in African American community and Hispanic community where there is homicide, that the high percentages are by a gun. And so I would ask that we look seriously at legislation I introduced, H.R. 65, and the gun storage and safety device bill, and a bill that also indicates, except for exceptions, that guns should not be in the hands of young people under the age of 21, that someone has allowed that to happen, there should be higher penalties on that individuals. I've been told by urban mayors that there are stash houses, that people can go and rent guns. Let's not be afraid of background checks, but more importantly, let's not be afraid of weeding out this horrible surge on our community, the death that families have to contend with. And then I think it is important to note that we've got to continue to speak on the issue of mental health needs. Tragedy occurred in Virginia, and the story that is unfolding saddens me, because that story is similar to the one in Sandy Hook, and the individual, the young perpetrator, had issues that they had to deal with in terms of their mental health. We've got to be able to provide more resources for beds for young people. We've got to intervene. We've got to help families. We've got to not run away from mental health issues, but run toward it. And then I'd like to make mention of those families who are suffering because their supplemental nutrition program over the last month has been cut. They're expecting in this budget coming forward that $40 billion will be on the table to cut again. I visited my food banks. I took the SNAP challenge and ate on that budget. No one should call those folks deadbeats. And every time there is a deadbeat, you can be assured that person will be found out. But I'm concerned about the seniors, the young children that go to bed hungry, and 1/2 of those who get SNAP benefits, supplemental nutrition benefits, are in actuality children. As we go toward this budget process, deadline December 13, let us have a sense of compassion. Let's have resources that will help us in the Department of Justice to be able to deal with this proliferation of guns, these Saturday night specials, these stash houses to help our children. Let's expand counseling and pronouncements by the local community that we're standing up against this violence that is attacking our children. Let's find dollars to help our local and state communities on resources for mental health. Let me thank one of the leaders in my community, Patrick, who's a Vietnam veteran, who has raised up the issue in Houston on the need for mental health beds and intervention. Stories that I have heard in my own community where a grandfather took his grandchild to a place, a county facility. They did not have a bed, and ultimately that grandchild stabbed and killed his grandfather and the grandfather's daughter. So we know that there are challenges, missions, and messages yet undone. Let's get to work on behalf of the American people. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ribble, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to discuss our nation's broken budget process and ways we can begin to fix it. The government shutdown is caused by the broken budget process. Funding our government with continuing resolutions is caused by a broken budget process. If we fix this, we could get away from this type of management of the taxpayers' dollars. Every year, Congress is required by law to pass a budget resolution. Every year, they're required to pass 12 appropriation bills by October 1st, the start of the fiscal year. Yet, since 2001, Congress has managed to enact only 8.3% of our required appropriation bills on time. In the past 8 election years, Congress has failed to pass a budget resolution a full 75% of the time. Washington Post recently did an article about this process, and it showed that this broken process allows federal departments and agencies to develop a use-it-or-lose-it mentality. A full 20% of all federal spending and contracting happens in the last month of the year, of the fiscal year. Look at how it spikes, and it's not just one time. It did it in 2010, 2011, 2012. The spending happens in the last month of the year, and in particular, the very last week of the year. And this is true about contracting as well. 156,000 contracts, 154,000 contracts, 149,000 contracts, all done in the last few weeks of each budget year. This use-it-or-lose-it mentality is costing the taxpayers millions of dollars. We must begin to fix this broken process, and that's why I introduced the Biennial Budgeting and Enhanced Oversight Act of 2013. It would cut this in half. Overnight, it would cut this in half. A biennial budgeting system, like the one my legislation creates, allows Congress to set budget and spending priorities in the first year and then do real oversight in the second year. This will allow Congress to better understand how the federal government is spending taxpayer money and be better equipped to make spending decisions in the future. This biennial budgeting process has strong bipartisan support with 110 co-sponsors so far, and they range from the most progressive member of Congress to the most conservative, painting a broad picture of support from members of Congress and the Americans that they represent. Here's a list of groups within Congress that have multiple members supporting the legislation: the House Budget Committee, the Republican Study Committee, the Tuesday Group, the Blue Dog Democrats, the New Democrat Coalition, the Progressive Caucus, a broad cross-section of the Congress and the people that they're here to represent. But not only that, every president since Ronald Reagan has supported biennial budgeting. Here's a quote from Jack Lew, the former OMB director and White House Chief of Staff, our nation's current Secretary of the Treasury. The two-year system is a good idea. The one-year budget process gives both the administration and Congress little time to focus on implementing the programs. It is time that we begin to address the serious nature of not managing the taxpayer dollars in following the requirements of the law. We need to fix this broken process this year. It is time to do it. Mr. Speaker, if the past few months have taught us anything, it's that our current budget process isn't working. It's time to create a system that will help us budget responsibly, foster greater certainty in the U.S. economy, and save taxpayer dollars. And we can do it in bipartisan fashion. I urge all members of Congress to co-sponsor H.R. 1869 today and help us govern again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to pay tribute to a woman who spent her life trying to help others. This is a tribute to Commissioner DeVera Beverly, a premier public housing advocate. In and around Chicago and in public housing circles throughout the nation, Ms. DeVera Beverly was known as a staunch defender and key player in making decisions about public housing issues and plans, not only in the Obla community where she lived, but throughout Chicago, and with impact on national policy. Ms. DeVera Beverly was what sociologists and urban planners and politicians call grassroots. She was from the people, of the people, and with the people, and a representative for the people. She was first of all a wife, a mother, a friend, a confidant, a leader who emerged from the people and was trusted by the people. Many people did not know it, but Ms. Beverly worked for the City of Chicago's Department of Human Services for more than 30 years, and after her retirement in 1997, devoted the rest of her life to providing leadership on Chicago public housing issues. She was president of the Local Advisory Council of Obla, vice president of the Central Advisory Council, acting chair and treasurer of the Central Advisory Council, and was a close friend and supporter of Commissioner Artensa Randolph, who set the bar for CHA resident leadership. As a result of her local leadership, national public housing leaders and groups were attracted to her, and she became a founding chair of the National Public Housing Museum. She was appointed a Chicago Housing Authority Commissioner by Mayor Daley and retained by Mayor Emanuel. Ms. Beverly was a skilled negotiator, and as a result of the many changes taking place in the Obla community, she often sat at the table with Alderman Bob Fioretti, Danny Solis, Jason Irwin, university officials, people from the mayor's office, philanthropists, developers, myself, and others. DeVera Beverly always expressed the position of the tenants, the people, and when you look at the Obla community today, much of it is a reflection of the thinking and the work of Commissioner DeVera Beverly. Contrary to popular opinion, working families do live in public and mixed-income housing. As a result of the process known as urban renewal, DeVera Beverly's family moved into the Obla homes in 1943. Her father was a postal employee. Her mother worked in the home. DeVera worked for the City of Chicago for more than 30 years. She did not have to live in Obla, but she chose to live there because that's where her heart was. And I guess maybe the poet Sam Walter Foss may have been thinking of her when he wrote his poem that said, "Let me live in the house by the side of the road where the race of men go by. Men who are good, bad, wise, and foolish, but then so am I. So why would I sit in the scorner's seat or hurl the cynic's ban? Just let me live in my house by the side of the road, like DeVera Beverly, and be a friend to men." I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Reed, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning to recognize the month of November as National Diabetes Awareness Month. It is observed every year in November to raise awareness of diabetes across America, but I am here to tell you, Mr. Speaker, diabetes is a 365-day, 24-hour-a-day, 7 days a week disease that kids, adults that deal with the disease have to attend to it. Mr. Speaker, how do I know that? Well, this is personal to me. My son, Will, was diagnosed at age 4 with type 1 diabetes. He is 13 now, Mr. Speaker, and he's growing up with this disease, and I can tell you that we get up every night, my wife in particular, as I stay down here in Washington, D.C., still monitor his blood sugar by poking his fingers and taking his blood at 2 o'clock in the morning every time he eats, just to see where his sugars are going to be. This is a disease that has not been cured, but I tell you, I am confident, Mr. Speaker, that we will find a cure. We need to find a cure. We work in our household with the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, JDRF. It is a great organization that dedicates a vast, significant majority of its funds to research for a cure for type 1 diabetes. Just last week, Mr. Speaker, at a town hall that I held in Fayette, New York, back in upstate New York, I had a young lady, 5 years old, come and speak before us and talk about diabetes and how it impacts her since she was diagnosed at the age of 3. This is a disease, Mr. Speaker, that we have the ability, in my opinion, to find a cure, and we need to work together in a bipartisan basis. I am Vice Chair of the Congressional Diabetes Caucus. It is the largest caucus here in Washington, D.C. And the focus on education and awareness of diabetes cannot just occur in November, but it must occur every day. I urge everyone to be aware of the risk factors and discuss your individual risks with your doctor, your health care provider. And my heartfelt thanks go out to all the providers and the parents and the caregivers of each and every person associated with somebody with this disease. Working together, my son Will, in his lifetime, will have a cure and won't have to deal with this disease every day. So please, take a moment, recognize this disease, and in November in particular, be aware of what diabetes is all about. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Kramer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me begin by thanking my colleague, Mr. Reid, for his leadership on the Diabetes Caucus. Thank you. That was very inspiring. Mr. Speaker, I am of the firm conviction that America's national security and America's economic security are tied directly to America's energy security. We have a wonderful opportunity today to vote on a couple of very important bills that will enhance that energy security. And I urge my colleagues to vote yes on both of them. You know, I get to represent the entire state of North Dakota. North Dakota was once described by one of our favorite sons, Eric Sevareid, the famous CBS newsman, as the rectangular blank spot in the nation's mind. But today, everybody's talking about North Dakota. Fastest growing economy in the world, the lowest unemployment rate in the country, fastest growing personal income in the country. In fact, today, Mr. Speaker, there are tens of thousands of high-paying jobs in North Dakota waiting for more people to come to the state to fill them. If you're willing to work hard and put in a full day's honest work, you can be very successful there. We've heard some speeches already this morning about the need to reduce hunger. We've heard some speeches this morning about the availability of affordable health care. I'm for both of those things. And the best way to enhance availability of health care, to reduce hunger, is to provide jobs. And so again, I would urge my colleagues today to vote for the bills that will be in front of us. H.R. 1965 is the Federal Lands, Jobs, and Energy Security Act. It's not a complicated bill. It acknowledges two things. It acknowledges the vast energy resources that our country owns under its federal lands, onshore. It also acknowledges contemporary technology that provides all of the security and safety that's required to do the job well. But what it does is that it diverts some of the resources into the right places that allows a streamlining of permitting while also empowering the local offices of our Bureau of Land Management, our U.S. Forest Service, in ways that allows them to do the jobs that they do very well even better. This is something I know a little bit about. Prior to coming to Congress, I was an energy regulator for 10 years in North Dakota. I worked closely with our federal partners. In fact, found them to be some of the best people that I had the opportunity to know. I just met with a number of them last week out in the western part of the state. They do a great job, but they need more resources, especially in an economy that is so competitive for workforce and so competitive in areas like rent and housing and the cost of living. And so by allowing the local offices to keep more of the permitting fees, we can channel the resources to allow them to do their jobs better and faster without compromising the integrity of their charge to protect our other natural resources above the ground. They do it as well as anybody, and we ought to let them do that job and empower them to do it. The H.R. 2728, Protecting States' Rights to Promote American Energy Act, simply acknowledges what the Constitution guarantees, and that is that we are a nation of states and that states are, in fact, sovereign. And that nobody is more protective of the land and the water and the air than the people who live on it and drink it and breathe it. It simply states that if you have fracturing rules in your state, that's good enough. It's your state. And that the federal government's minimum standards ought not be an imposition on the states and their rights to develop their resources the way they want to. It frees up resources of the federal government while unleashes the ingenuity and innovation of our energy economy, providing wealth, providing jobs, and by the way, reducing the cost of energy for the rest of us, which makes us even more competitive in the global marketplace. We have a grand opportunity today, Mr. Speaker, to pass these two bills and to put America on a path to full economic recovery and perhaps to bring more troops home from the Middle East to reduce our dependency on foreign oil. And let's do this not only as a country but as a continent, acknowledging that our friends in Canada are better trading partners than Venezuela. Let's build the pipelines and infrastructure necessary. Let's unleash American ingenuity, and let's put America back to work by becoming more energy secure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.